Thank you so much. I am incredibly honored to be here. My name is Paul Frazee, and today I'm going to be talking about formalizing user rights on the web. Now, before I get started, let me give some context about who I am. I'm located in Austin, Texas. I'm a JavaScript developer. I've been working with Node.js for about 5 years. I've been making websites and web applications for just about all my life. I personally have an enormous amount of passion for distributed systems and peer-to-peer technology. I think they're technically fascinating, but I also think that there's an incredible potential in these kinds of technologies that have not yet been leveraged in the web. And so that's what I pursue a lot in my daily life. I was one of the people who helped start the Secure Scuttlebutt project, which is a peer-to-peer social network. And Scuttlebutt is extremely active today. But now I spend my days working on the Beaker browser. And Beaker is an experimental peer-to-peer web browser. We work on it because we want to see if it's possible to let users publish websites without having to use servers at all. We want to see if you could just have a button, perhaps, in the browser. You can click that, and then you can publish the site from your laptop or from a mobile device. And then you don't have to worry about operations, and things are much easier for you. Now, if you're curious to hear a little bit more about how that works, like they said earlier, you should listen to Tara Vancel's talk later tonight. She's giving a talk called Imagine This, a Web Without Servers. What I'm going to be talking about is a little bit about what animates us to work on this project, why we care so much about this idea, and why we think it can have such a positive effect on the web. Now, we are huge advocates for the open web. I think it's incredible that we have this shared platform that's not encumbered by any patents or licenses, and that isn't owned by any one corporation. But lately, I think the web has been struggling with systemic problems. Issues with things like bullying and harassment online, misinformation campaigns that affect our elections, infringements of personal privacy, and honestly, the list goes on. Now, I think in a way, all of these systemic problems stem or have some kind of relationship to one basic question. And that question is, who's in charge? Now, I don't mean this in a sort of a petty sense, like who happens to be the market leader from one moment to another, but actually in a very profound sense about who has the authority to govern our communities and our applications and our online lives. And more importantly than that, perhaps, what gives them that right to be the people that govern our experiences. On top of that, I think we also should understand what kind of rights we have as users. What rights do we have to control the software we use? What rights do we have to control the algorithms that affect our perception of the world? What rights do we have to control the moderation policies that affect these issues that affect us every day? And so you can talk about political rights. In fact, there's been some amazing work recently with the GDPR, but there's actually something else. There's a kind of right that emerges, I believe, specifically from the technical design of the web and the architectures of networks in general. And this technical right is derived from what everybody is able to do. And so that's the right that we're going to be talking about here today. Now, I think it's important that we go through some of the stuff that is the problem right now, which means we're going to have to go through some slightly offensive content. I tried to censor it a little bit, so it shouldn't be too bad, but just so you know, it's kind of annoying. Let's start with talking about harassment. We'll mostly talk about Twitter, but Twitter, of course, is not the only community that has this problem. Here's Susan Fowler talking about anti-Semitism filling her notifications. Just recently, Jessica Valenti had a death threat in her notifications. She had to struggle a little bit to get Twitter's moderation teams to take it seriously. You don't have to go far to find this kind of stuff. And I don't think this is news to anybody. The internet is full of trolls, right? In fact, the running joke at this point is that Twitter is a cesspool. Well, you could say that this is just how it goes. We should develop a thick skin, and perhaps this kind of behavior is just the cost of free speech. And perhaps that's the case, except that I'm beginning to believe that this kind of behavior is affecting our culture and our political systems. I don't think I'm the only one to think that. At the end of last year, Reid Hoffman weighed in on this issue, how he would solve the problems of hate speech and bigotry and things like that, abuse on our social media platforms. So Reid Hoffman is the co-founder of LinkedIn. People will want to hear what he has to say. So in this interview, he basically gave his prescription, and it was this. These are private businesses. All these social media platforms, they're private businesses. And they can set policies about what kind of behavior they expect from their users, from their participants on the platform. The metaphor that he uses is kind of like a hotel or a restaurant. You could set a policy, no shirt, no shoes, no service, right? Well, same thing here. Project a more opinionated view about what kind of speech is permissible on your platform. That's what he's putting out. Now, to some degree, I actually think he has a fair point. But what he's suggesting really highlights what I think is kind of a constant problem with how the web works. It kind of highlights how we're all stuck between a rock and a hard place on this matter. Because on the one hand, I'm not the sort of person who is animated by concerns about censorship. That's not my day-to-day. My day-to-day concern is much more about bullying or death threats to somebody I love or misinformation campaigns that might affect the elections in my country. That bothers me a lot more. But at the same time, I think you cannot ignore the fact that we just had a very serious conversation about the possibility that Mark Zuckerberg could run for president. And this guy runs one of the most powerful information sharing platforms in the world. Over 2 billion users use Facebook to get their daily news. So the idea that we, at this juncture, would start to ask corporations to more proactively police our speech is actually, I think, a slightly bad idea. And so it seems like we're stuck between these two options. On the one hand, you have Trolltopia, where everything is permissible. And on the other hand, you have a sort of corporate hegemony, where speech is being policed by big businesses. And it seems like there ought to be something in between this, something which is perhaps driven by users. And yet it's not there. As it happens, Mark Zuckerberg is not particularly interested in Reid Hoffman's suggestion. He's extremely adamant that Facebook is not a media company. They're just a tools company. If they were a media company, they would control what kind of media is put on Facebook, and that's his point. That's not their job. And he says this because, to be honest, he wants Facebook to be popular. As soon as they start getting into these hard decisions about what sort of behavior is permissible, they very easily get into partisan fights and they start losing users because they're seen as biased. And this sort of dovetails nicely into a conversation about misinformation. So we're still in our systemic problems portion of the talk here. Let's talk a little bit about what happened at the 2016 American election. This is a Washington Post article, and we're going to go through some of the ads that were run illegally by a Russian propaganda arm using Facebook's ad targeting platform. This first one, if you were opposed to Muslim immigration, you'd get this law from this Russian propaganda organization saying Sharia law should not be debatable. If you were a Christian conservative, you got Jesus arm wrestling the devil. If the devil won, then Clinton won the election. All right. If you're a supporter of strong borders, you got this no invaders allowed. If you're a Southern conservative, you got a fake Tea Party endorsement for Trump. They actually spanned the political spectrum, though. If you're an LGBT supporter, you got this ad against the Westboro Baptist Church, which is a hate group. If you're a Hillary Clinton supporter, you got this ad talking about how Hillary Clinton is supportive of Muslim citizens. The strategy they were pursuing is getting you to click like, because then they could push more propaganda to you. And then the meta strategy was to strengthen Trump's base and divide Clinton's. There's a lot of examples of what happened and what went wrong in the 2016 election with misinformation. I think if you want more, you could look at what happened in Reddit. And of course, Twitter has its own problems. But this next example that I decided to fit in with the time I have, I think was important to illustrate because it really cuts to the heart of how this sort of stuff happens. And that's this one. This is an article published by ProPublica at the end of last year. There is an advertising demographic on Facebook. It was Jew haters. You could target Jew haters with your ads. It was apparently 2,274 people put this as their field of study. Now, I don't know if they thought they were being funny or if they were serious. It doesn't really matter. But somehow, Facebook's algorithms picked up on this and started to make it a group that you could advertise to. And I just want to point out that UI element underneath there. Yeah, I think so. Okay, why is this happening? Is Facebook intentionally setting out to collude with the Russians to mess with our elections in America? Is there some Facebook employee that is adding that Jew hater entry into the database? I don't think so. I don't think that's what happened. I don't know, but I doubt it. What I think is happening here is the same thing that happens with every Silicon Valley company that is trying to achieve enormous amounts of scale. They're just using algorithms. And they're accepting user data without considering just how problematic that user data can be. This is a screenshot of YouTube. David Hogg is one of the Parkland shooting survivors. So he's a high school kid, survived a school shooting, which keeps happening in America. He decided to become extremely vocal about his opposition, or actually his support, rather, his support for gun control. People who didn't like his politics decided to spread a conspiracy theory that he's actually a paid political actor, what you call a crisis actor. And so I guess enough people searched for that on YouTube, because gradually that started to show up as the only thing. Whenever you type in his name, all these suggestions that you should look into him being a crisis actor. So it's a combination of these algorithms, and then what I could only describe as, I suppose, the political weaponization that's occurring on the web, and that is going to continue to occur. Because these platforms have the power to push an agenda. And every time you have one of these algorithms that blindly trusts user input, that's another vector. It's another opportunity to push propaganda. Okay. These are problems. They're problems in how we govern our communities online. And when you see problems like this, I think you naturally have to ask, who's in charge? Whose job is it to solve these kinds of problems? And I think this is where we see technology and civics collide in an incredibly specific way. Because we're talking about the system of authority and the system of governance. Whose job is it to maintain these communities online? If you look at Reddit, it's ostensibly designed to be a democracy. In fact, it's probably one of the most democratic websites online. The users submit stories and then they vote on what shows up on the front page. It's great. But if you actually look at the civic structure of Reddit, it's not actually a democracy. It's actually more like a monarchy. Because you have the users voting on stories, submitting comments, and voting on those as well. Then above that, you have moderator users, and they have the power to remove content, to remove users, things like that. But then on the top, you have the Reddit staff. And they're basically the kings of this community. They have total control. They can change the code, they can change the data, they can do anything. And in fact, they sort of highlighted this about a year ago when Steve Huffman decided to, he's the CEO of Reddit, he decided to jump into the Donald and manually edit some of the comments of users in the Donald. He figured it'd be funny, he'd troll the trolls, right? And perhaps if you didn't really know how websites work, you might be shocked to realize that somebody on the Reddit staff could just change people's comments. But I think probably most of us here are technologists and we're intuitively aware, well, of course they can do that. They run the server, right? So that dovetails into this next question. What is it about the web that makes it like this? Why did the Reddit staff act as the king? And why do they have total authority? I think it flows directly from this thick server design, the architecture of applications on the web. Thick server is actually a technical term. It means that we put all the business logic into the server, and actually, as a result, all of the authority. So if you diagram it, it looks a little bit like this. You got the thick server up at the top, and you have the database in there. You have all the code, and you have all the authority placed in the server. And then you have the web browsers, the clients, and you actually call them a thin client. Thick server, thin client. And the thin client is just a view of this data, just a rendering of what's occurring on the server. And anytime you want to do something as one of the clients, you actually have to ask the server to do it for you. So all of the authority lives in the server, and if you have any authority as a user, you're actually just borrowing it from the server in a way. Well, what is it about the web that makes it like that? Why are the servers king? There's nothing in the nature of computers that make it this way. If you look at computers in a state of nature, hanging out next to each other, you look at a server, you look at a normal desktop computer or a laptop, sure, the server's more powerful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the server ought to be king. The server doesn't have to be in charge, but that's how it is. So why is that if it's not in the hardware? The answer has to do with this. It has to do with the specifications and the standards that define the web, HTTP, HTML, all of the web APIs. They encode this set of behaviors. This is a very clear example of how technology doesn't just interact with civics, but it actually drives civics. It defines what the civic structure of a community is going to be. In a way, you could say that these specifications are like a shared contract between us, or perhaps even kind of like a constitution, because they define how our online society of computers are going to work with each other. There's nothing in the hardware that does this. It's in the specifications. It's in this shared agreement. It's these rules that bind us together and define how our computers will relate to each other. And it really is kind of like a contract or a constitution, because it's just an agreement between the devices to follow these rules. It isn't a constitution like the kind that these people made, but it is the kind made by people like this, the hackers that set the web in motion. And it didn't produce documents that looked like this, but it did produce specs like this. And there is a parallel there, because all of our computers, everybody here, we use the image tag. That's how that happens. So when we ask what gives the server the right to be king over our application, well, the answer is that it's in the architecture. It's how the web is designed. Now, it's not just the authority model that's encoded in these architectures. It's also the individual capabilities of everybody in the network. What can my computer do on the web? Those questions are answered in the specifications, and this gets us back to that idea of a right. What rights does my machine have? What rights does the server have? And so I'm going to try to get us a term here, an architectural right. This is a right that is given to my device, and it is encoded in the architecture of the web, or really of any network. Let's go through some examples to kind of make it intuitive. Here we have a local area network. We're going to go with a pretty natural design for a local area network. Everybody can connect to everybody else. So we have Alice, Bob, and Carla. Their machines can talk freely to each other. And so you might say that there's an architectural right in this design. There's a right for everybody to connect to everybody else. You don't have to make the LAN this way. You might decide that Alice is actually much more important and you can't maybe trust Bob and Carla in your architecture. So you could do it like this, where only Alice is allowed to create new connections. And Bob and Carla, they just have to listen. You definitely could do it this way. But if you did, you'd basically have a two-tiered architecture, two kinds of citizen. Alice, who has the right to connect, and Bob and Carla, who do not. They can only listen. Let's look at another example of the internet. Internet's kind of like our LAN, because the internet has the same basic principle. Everybody should be able to connect to everybody else. Should be able to connect to everybody else. So you could say that there is a right to connect globally, encoded in the design of the internet, in the architecture of the internet. Again, you didn't have to do it this way. You could do it like China has done it. Oh, well, excuse me. I just want to point out, sometimes the internet doesn't work quite so well because there's not enough IP addresses in their firewalls. That's what that slide's about. Now, like I was saying, you don't have to do it this way. You could do it like China does it, right? You could set up a global government firewall. Or you could set up something like a municipal server somewhere that you have to talk to and ask permission to make a connection. That is how you could do the internet. We chose not to. We chose to make it so that everybody can connect to everybody else. And I think that means something really important. It means that there is a value set encoded in that standard, in all the standards that define the web. A right to connect globally. It is not a neutral decision. Okay, so we have an idea about how architectural rights work. Let's take a look at the web. You might say there's two kinds of citizen on the web, like we were talking about before. You have the client and you have the server. And the client is your browser or your user agent. So let's step through some of the rights that each of these kinds of citizens on the web have. Well, the client, of course, has the right to browse. It can go from one website to another and visit content. Of course, it can do that. Clients have the right to filter as well. You can run an ad blocker. You might also call this a right to mutate, because you could run extensions and change things once you receive them. This is up to some interpretation, but I'd say those are the two. That's really what a client is allowed to do on the web. So let's look at a server. Servers have the right to an identity, an address, a .com, right? And only servers have that on the web. Browsers don't have addresses. They don't have identities. If you want to have an identity on the web, you either need to be a server or you need to ask a server to make an identity for you, because they're the only ones with the right to do that. So that's why I'm twitter.com/pfrazee. Right? Let's look at the next right, a right to publish. This is what a server is designed to do on the web. It's what they do whenever they're hosting content. They're publishing that content. Again, that's a right that only the server has. The client can't do that. If I want to publish something, I either need to be a server or I need to ask a server to do something. And that's why I do all my tweets on twitter.com. Because they control the publishing, servers have a right to moderate as well. They can choose what they publish. Sort of falls naturally out from having the sort of dominant right to publishing. And then servers can also choose what code they deploy. They get to choose the data model. They get to choose how the application behaves, where the data goes. Now, when you look at this two-tiered citizenship on the web, it's kind of totally unsurprising that there's an asymmetrical power dynamic involved here. Because not only do the servers have more rights, they're way better rights. That's the power to control how the web applications work. The clients, they're passive. The best thing they can do is make a choice about where they go. So when you're talking about these problems of governance online, how do we solve these tough questions about moderation policies and the truth of information? And you're asking, well, how can we make governance better? I think you have to start by asking, how can we give new rights to clients so that the civic structure is no longer being constrained by the design of the web, and the architecture can have a more, perhaps even democratic design in how it's governed? Could we make it so that the client actually has the right to publish, instead of always depending on a server to do it for them? Could we make it even so the client has the right to having an identity, so that my personal identity is no longer tied to whatever happens to Twitter? Could we even give clients the right to deploy the code, so that they could decide how their application should work? Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that I work on peer-to-peer networks. In this context, peer-to-peer networks really fascinate me, because unlike client-server networks, they connect nodes in a way such that they all have the same capabilities. The rights are completely evenly distributed in a peer-to-peer network. In fact, that's sort of implicit in the name. We're all just peers. I think that has an equalizing force across the network. It'd be easy in a way to make this talk largely about free software, because in a lot of ways it's deeply connected, this ability to control our right to modify how the experience works. But I actually think it's a little bit bigger than that. I think it's about our ability to decide how code works as a community. That makes it a question of civics, not just free software. Every time we ask Twitter or Facebook to make a change to their moderation policies, to their feed algorithms, even to their interfaces, it's actually kind of a big deal. It requires those companies to take a risk, to potentially lose users, or change something that's fundamental to their success in the past. And as a result, they may not be willing to make those kinds of risks. Well, when users have the option to develop the software completely on their own, to pursue their own needs and problems and ideas, they don't have to be afraid that it might hurt their bottom line. They don't have to think in terms of maximizing their engagement numbers. They can just think about solving their own problems. As technologists, I think it's our job not to solve problems for people, but to give them the tools to solve those problems, so that they can decide what is best for them, especially in these contexts of these global societies like the web is. I think perhaps it's easy to think of the web as being somewhat fixed and in a stable place, as if we've already experienced the full history of the web. But the web has only been around for about 30 years. So what are the next 30 years going to be like? Are we going to continue to use Facebook and Twitter? Is it going to be the same governance model? Are we still going to have servers as king? Or are we as users going to be defining much more of our experience in the future? Really think about it. 30 years from now, is it going to be like this? I believe in civic engagement. And I believe it in all kinds. Legal rights and regulations are very powerful, and I'm extremely excited about what the GDPR will do for our industry. But the legal system is not our only option. And as people who shape technology and shape the web, we have powerful tools at our disposal. Technology is not neutral. It encodes a set of values, and as a political system, it encodes a set of rights. And so it will be up to us to decide what our online civic structures will be like. And I hope you take this time to consider which structures of power and which rights you're enabling in the architectures that you build. Thank you all very much.